Hello and welcome. I'm Kelly Weiss, Executive Director of Marketing and Communications. Thank you for being here as we continue our Racial Justice Speaker Series. I wanted to give a few housekeeping rules before we get started. So we will have our lecture from Professor Wade, and after that we'll take questions. How we take questions is through our chat function, and you will send those directly to me, and then I will ask Professor Wade those questions and we can carry on with our Q&A. We will be recording today's lecture that will be available on our website. And also, if you have requested MCLE credits, those will be emailed to you after the event. So now I want to pass it over to Senior Associate Dean Afra Afsharpour.
Thank you, Kelly. Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for being here. Pardon the noise. I'm Afra Afsharpour. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at UC Davis School of Law, and I welcome you to the UC Davis Racial Justice Speaker Series. Throughout the last 2 years, we have used this speaker series to explore issues of racial justice across many areas of the law, including constitutional law, criminal law, family law, immigration law, and corporate law, as well as other areas. I'm so delighted and fortunate to introduce our Racial Justice Speaker Series speaker today, Professor Cheryl Wade, someone who I've long admired. Professor Wade is the Dean Harold F. McNeese Professor of Law at St. John's University School of Law. She teaches issues of race, gender and the law, business organizations, corporate governance and accountability, and race and business. Professor Wade is an accomplished scholar and a real leader in corporate law. She's a member of the American Law Institute, a national organization of prominent judges, lawyers, and academics who work to clarify, modernize, and reform the law. She has written countless book chapters and law review articles on securities law, education law, and at the intersection of race and business law. She's really one of the leaders in the field with respect to these issues. Her recent book, Predatory Lending and the Destruction of the African American Dream, was published by Cambridge University Press in July 2020 and was co-authored with Dr. Janice Sarah, Professor of Law at the University of British Columbia. The book explores the widening racial wealth gap between Black and white Americans and analyzes the economic exploitation of African Americans with a focus on predatory practices in the home mortgage context. This really important work is one that should be read by anyone seeking to understand racial inequality in the United States. Today, Professor Wade is going to present her latest work, Privilege and Exploitation, Racial Injustice and the Corporate Person. Her presentation will examine race as an integral part of corporate law and governance, a topic of utmost importance in corporate law and one that is finally getting some much needed attention. So please join me in welcoming my friend and colleague, Professor Cheryl Wade.
Thank you so very much, Afra, for that very generous introduction. I have been a longtime fan of your brilliant work, and I really do very much appreciate that you invited me to be part of this Racial Justice Speaker Series. I am now going to share my screen to share with you a PowerPoint presentation that I won't use for the whole talk. I simply want to set the stage for the next few minutes of my discussion with you. I'd like for you to travel back in time with me just a few years to 2018. It seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? We've been through so much since then, the pandemic and a bunch of other things. But most of you will remember that ABC that year fired Roseanne Barr after she made some racially bigoted comments about Valerie Jarrett, an African-American woman who was then working in the Obama cabinet. And Starbucks closed its stores nationwide for an afternoon of training after a white employee called the police on 2 Black men who were in the store waiting for a meeting, but they hadn't bought anything. So these two companies, these two corporations, Starbucks and ABC, they took a knee against anti-Black racism, a metaphorical knee. And then just 2 years later, with the death of George Floyd, hundreds, if not thousands, I'm trying to figure out, get a ballpark number of a ballpark number of the companies who issued anti-racism, some call them diversity statements, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. But it seems that just 2 short years later, in 2022, we've come to realize that these statements were pretty empty. And even though many companies spoke in terms of anti-racism, most companies have now fallen back on what I consider pretty empty rhetoric that just relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, all important goals. But I'll tell you why I think that the rhetoric is empty. So one of the things I'm considering in this talk today is the fact that corporate America has had some limited but important success in contributing to the upward mobility of African Americans. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. But it's also important that we acknowledge the ways that public companies have exacerbated both the racial income gap and the racial wealth gap. And I'll be spending most of my time today talking about some of the research based on the book that Afra mentioned to you relating to the racial wealth gap. I'll be talking this afternoon about corporate governance and racial progress. And in doing so, I'll describe a success story about African-American employees. It's not a perfect story, but it is a success story. And it's a story that focuses on one type of corporate stakeholder, employees. And then I'll go on to talk about corporate governance and racism. And in that context, when focusing on predatory lending and the research from the book, I'll be talking about two different kinds of stakeholders, consumers of color and communities of color. I just want to note some specifics about the language I've chosen to use in this piece and this afternoon. For this talk, this is not evident in the book, but for this talk, I'm referring to African Americans as people who are the descendants of people who were enslaved in the US, people whose ancestors arrived in the nation, were brought to the nation generations ago, centuries ago. And I'm providing some context for the different realities for people of African descent in the US. That of course includes African Americans, but when I talk about people of African descent, or when I talk about Black people in the US, I'll be talking about people who are recent immigrants from Africa. I'll be talking about people who are immigrants from the West Indies or the Caribbean, or the children and grandchildren of recent immigrants or immigrants from a couple of generations ago. But my point, with which I'll wrap up at the end of the talk, will be that explicit, honest discussion, not just about diversity and equity and inclusion, but also about race and racism, and more narrowly about the racialization of corporations, how they're racialized. I think that will provide some very important insight about racial privilege and exploitation. First, I should define corporate governance very quickly. There's a broad definition that simply refers to the way decisions are made in public companies. And sometimes it's more narrowly defined to refer to processes that mediate the relationships among shareholders, officers, and directors. And so shareholders and officers and directors are the three primary corporate constituents. But my work is concerned also with stakeholders, such as the employees I will discuss in the success story, and the consumers of color and the communities of color in which corporations do business that I'll discuss when I get to the predatory lending part of today's talk. Afra already mentioned the book, but I want to share with you some photos that I just took about 3 or 4 weeks ago. This photo is taken in an all Black neighborhood, and you see signs like these, posters like these slapped up all throughout Black and brown neighborhoods. And all of these signs say, "Stop foreclosure." So it makes people who are still facing the threat of foreclosure as a result of predatory loans, it makes people stop and call these numbers, hoping that the person who will answer will help them in the foreclosure process, to stop the foreclosure process, perhaps help them to negotiate with lenders who hold mortgages now. And that's not what happens. What callers will hear is a high pressure sales pitch to get the caller, the homeowner who's threatened with foreclosure, to sell the house at a bargain price. The foreclosure will be avoided, and that's good for the caller's credit history, but the caller, the homeowner, will still lose the home. Here's yet another sign taken not too far away, but in another all Black neighborhood. I'm not saying predominantly Black, it's all Black. And this sign also has the words "Stop foreclosure." There's a little bit more honesty in this sign because it's clear that you'll be contacting a real estate person or a real estate agency, someone who's involved in purchases and sales, but someone who has no interest in helping the caller stop foreclosure. I'd like to note also that I included this picture because the person in the picture is Black. And what Janice and I found in our research is that very often you would see a picture, a photo, or even an actual Black person who convinced other Black people to do business with predatory lenders. And typically they were unsuspecting. They didn't know about the predatory practices, but this was a kind of affinity fraud that was common in the years leading up to the economic downturn of 2008. And even now, even today, this is another sign that is still up in this neighborhood. I just took this picture a few days ago. And finally, with respect to my PowerPoint, this sign is just 1 mile away from my mother's home in Queens. And again, they promise that they are in the business of stopping foreclosure. My hope is that any passersby who see this sign, and they're all over my mom's neighborhood, that they will look 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down and see this typo here. Instead of "don't lose your home," "don't loose your home." And I'm hoping that will discourage people from making this call to what is likely to be a predator. So let me go straight to the success story that I just mentioned a moment ago. This is a story about a historical phenomenon that all of you have heard about, and that is the Great Migration. And so you all know that starting early in the 20th century, more than 6 million African Americans migrated from the rural South to the North, to the West, and to the Midwest of the United States. And these migrants were attempting to escape violence, but they were also searching for dignified work that provided fair wages. Their success, the migrants' success, their literal and figurative upward mobility was advanced by the practical reality of how corporations are governed. At several corporations, one person, a single person, one founder of a corporation, one controlling shareholder, or one chief executive officer dramatically changed the lives of masses of people within the corporation and even beyond the corporation. Consider the corporate governance decisions of business leaders at mid-20th century companies like the Pullman Company, the Ford Motor Company, the Pepsi-Cola Company, three of the first companies to hire Black Americans, African Americans beyond the plantation, and people on plantations, of course, were not hired. But leaders like Henry Ford used their tremendous power that they had within their firms in a way that changed their companies and also changed the world beyond their companies. Their decisions to hire African-American migrants, of course, it changed the lives of the workers, it changed the lives of their family members, and it has impacted subsequent generations. And even though Black and white workers were not treated equally once they were hired, the very fact that they were hired at all transformed the entire nation. Now, as I said earlier, this is a success story, but it's not a perfect story. Ford Motor Company was the first employer to pay Black men the same wages that white men received. But Black men were relegated to the dirtiest and most dangerous jobs within the Ford Motor Company factories. In fact, Henry Ford believed that Black people were intellectually inferior. So he thought that Black men were especially well suited for assembly line work because their inferior intellect prevented them from getting bored with the monotony of assembly line work. But these inequities, they don't erase the power, the limited power of these corporate governance stories, because these stories illustrate the potential power of business leaders, not only to impact corporate culture, but also the ability of business leaders to shape social conduct beyond their companies. So many, if not most of the white Americans who worked for Pullman and Ford and Pepsi in the mid-20th century, they disagreed with the controversial decision made by these leaders, these business leaders, to hire African-American migrants. But who cares? Their disagreement was irrelevant. And this is the nature of corporate governance. Business leaders establish corporate climates, they establish norms, and they establish internal rules. And with this blunt power, the CEO and the executives at the top of corporate hierarchies, they alone determine corporate culture. It's true, we live in a democratic nation, but US corporations are not democracies. Anyone who is only near the top of a hierarchy, a corporate hierarchy, or at the middle or bottom of the hierarchy has to conform to the executive's vision for the company. And for that reason, corporations are very good at changing conduct when the people leading the company decide that change is needed. When few corporate leaders, just a few of them, changed their companies by hiring African-American men during the Great Migration, that change, the impact of that change within those iconic companies reverberated beyond the companies. The corporate changes impacted people outside of the corporation who had believed that African-American men and women were unfit for any kind of work beyond the plantation. And it's not clear that their hearts and minds were changed, but they did see a change in the nation that started with these large companies that did hire for reasons of profit maximization, that did hire African-American men. But when it comes to other corporate stakeholders of color, like consumers of color and communities of color, communities in which companies do business, we see a different story. We don't see a story of upward mobility for the most part. we see a story of a downward spiral. And that's the predatory lending debacle. It provides a present day narrative that shows what happens to racial justice when corporate governance fails. In a 10-year period from 2008 until 2018, there were 17 million home foreclosures in the United States, and a disproportionately large number of individuals who lost homes, who lost life savings, are Black. My book with Janice Sarah is a story about systemic racism. It's racism that links, that is connecting financial markets, financial institutions, public companies, courts, and even housing agencies. And we describe the 21st century attack on the Black working and middle classes. And we provide analyses and narratives that help to explain why a racial wealth gap exists between Black and white Americans, and why the gap gets wider and wider. Predatory lending destroys Black communities by draining wealth from the working class and middle class individuals and families who bring stability to neighborhoods that are racially homogenous, but socioeconomically diverse. I'm talking about neighborhoods where working class and middle class people live among neighbors who do not work at all. In other words, the communities that were most and are still most dramatically impacted are all Black. They're racially homogenous, but people at various socioeconomic levels live together in one neighborhood. Janice and I interviewed predatory lending victims in Detroit, Baltimore, and New York City. And we described the intentional targeting of Black consumers for predatory subprime mortgages, even when they qualified for lower cost loans, and even when similarly situated white Americans received lower cost prime loans. Black borrowers with excellent credit histories were steered into high cost predatory mortgages. And this happened to working class Black borrowers, middle class Black borrowers, and even affluent Black consumers. Affluent Black people, they lost wealth, but working and middle class victims, they lost homes. And millions of others are still struggling, even in 2022, to keep their homes. These people, these individuals are trying to navigate a mortgage modification process that is also predatory. Much of the predatory conduct that we describe in our book was motivated by explicit anti-Black bias on the part of individuals. And this individual bias, of course, infected corporate systems, structures, cultures, institutions. So we're talking about both personal bias and systemic bias. Let me give you an example. Wells Fargo was sued for its predatory lending practices, and some of its former loan officers were asked to or had to testify in depositions. One of the former loan officers said that throughout several branches of Wells Fargo, Black people were not called Black people, they were called mud people. And that the predatory subprime loans into which they were steered were called ghetto loans. This is in the 21st century. And then yet another former Wells Fargo loan officers testified that the pervasive perception at the bank was that Black people were just not savvy enough to know when they were getting a bad loan. They just were not savvy enough to know that they qualified for a cheaper mortgage. I remember when I first read this, and I asked myself, well, are white Americans more savvy? We'll never know the answer to that question because white Americans were not systematically targeted in the way Black and brown borrowers were. Black Americans were 4 times as likely as similarly situated white Americans to pay subprime rates, even when controlling for factors such as borrower income and property location. Lenders used high pressure sales tactics to get Black Americans into predatory loans. They imposed punitive prepayment penalties. They used intentionally misleading terms in the mortgage documents. They provided false estimates. They imposed hidden fees. They extended no doc loans or no documentation loans, even when the borrowers had documentation, because the no doc loans earned more money for the lenders. And consumers of color who did not qualify for mortgages at all, they were put into predatory subprime loans, even though they had no job, no income, and no assets. These were called ninja loans. They were also called liar loans. And when I first read the term liar loan, I thought that the borrowers lied about income and assets and jobs, but it was the lenders who lied. The lenders would draft mortgages that claimed that the borrowers did in fact have a source of income. Lenders claimed that the borrowers held assets. And then when the consumers noticed this in the documents, lenders told the consumers, that's okay, this is the way it's done, don't worry about it. You'll be able to pay off your mortgage because housing prices will continue to climb, and you'll be able to refinance and take out the equity in your home and pay your mortgage. And we all know the rest of that story. We're living in the rest of that story. So in 2022, borrowers, they need to modify their predatory mortgages if they haven't already lost their homes to foreclosure. But the mortgages were pooled together to create securities that were sold to investors. Borrowers' loans are being serviced not by the original lenders, but by companies completely unwilling to negotiate, companies with whom the borrowers have no relationship. For a while, investors made money from this subprime mortgage-backed securities market that was created by the securitization process. But Black homeowners' wealth continues to wane as they try to hold on to their homes. They're paying fees to financial firms that refuse to agree to reasonable modification terms. And of course, they're paying significant amounts of money for attorneys. My co-author and I examined 13 settlement agreements in which venerable financial institutions were accused of predatory lending and were sued. They admitted no wrongdoing, but they paid millions to settle those suits. Companies like Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase. I mentioned Wells Fargo, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, UBS. Those are just some of the 13 settlements we looked at. And what we found in examining these settlements was that investors in the securitized mortgages, they received almost $12.1 billion from the settlement amounts, billion with a B, but not $1 went to reduce the principal that victims owed on predatory mortgages. And tragically, there are new iterations of predatory lending. I can talk about that if anyone is interested in that in the Q&A. You may be asking yourselves at this point, why? Why were Black people targeted for these expensive subprime predatory mortgages? Well, first of all, this predation made a great deal of money for the banks, for the brokers, for the loan officers. But this doesn't explain why Black consumers were targeted. And we try in the book to at least partially answer that question. We do so by describing a study about negative stereotypes held about African Americans in the 20th century and the 21st century. Stereotypes that perpetuate the myth of African American intellectual inferiority, stereotypes that were aimed at justifying enslavement and Jim Crow and the general history of African Americans. And you see how that's connected and how it's still relevant to the Wells Fargo debacle, where the loan officer said, look, Black people are just not savvy enough to know that they're getting bad loans. I think at this point, I should also explain why I focus on Black consumers, even though Latinx borrowers were targeted for predatory loans. The history and the present day narratives are different for the Latinx community when compared to Black people in the United States. Present day discourse frequently questions why, after being in the United States for so many generations, African Americans seem unable to accumulate wealth. And African Americans are compared to other racial groups in which home ownership is much higher. African Americans are also compared to other Black people, relatively recent Black immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa. The home ownership and wealth disparities between Black Americans on one hand and Caribbean, Latinx, and recent African immigrants is explained, I think, by historical context. We cannot ignore the history in the United States about the intentional and violent destruction of African American wealth accumulated sometimes by individuals, accumulated by entire communities. The destruction, the intentional, violent destruction of Black businesses, vibrant communities like Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Tulsa story is only one of many examples of the destruction, the violent destruction of several successful Black communities. But of course, predatory lenders didn't make these kinds of distinctions among Black people. African Americans, Black people of Caribbean descent, and relatively recent immigrants from Africa all were steered into predatory loans. Some of the people we interviewed for the book were African or West Indian immigrants, and Janice and I didn't get to this point in the book. It's part of work that I'm now doing. Some of the people we interviewed were the children or grandchildren of African and West Indian immigrants. But like African Americans, whose ancestors have lived in the United States for generations, for centuries, people who immigrated from Africa and from the Caribbean were painted with the same brush of intellectual inferiority and were seen as easy victims. So let me get to what I think corporate America can do to advance racial justice rather than impede racial justice, rather than impede upward mobility for people of color. I think the first step requires engaging in more honest, explicit, and accurate discussion about race and racism and discrimination. Business leaders simply cannot remain stuck in diversity, equity, and inclusion discourse. DEI programs won't work without acknowledging that racism and discrimination are still prevalent. Business leaders have to understand that diversity efforts alone, they're just not enough. Diversity work brings more people of color into relationships with corporations as employees, as consumers, as suppliers. But then racism chases them away, especially employees. In other words, racism obliterates the goals that diversity work attempts to achieve. The narrow issue, in my opinion, that has broad implications involves figuring out how corporate leaders can avoid the tendency to allow difficult discussions about racism to devolve into the more comfortable, happy, boilerplate discourse about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's exactly what happened in the last 2 years. In 2020, after George Floyd was murdered, business leaders issued anti-racism statements. But by 2022, by now, most of those discussions have led to very little, and business leaders are falling back into the DEI discourse. I think that corporate leaders will move closer to meaningful and honest discussion about racism if they understand and acknowledge the ways that US corporations are racialized. Corporations are racialized in ways that are similar to the racializing of individuals. It's common for courts to impute race to a corporation in race discrimination cases. For example, Black-owned or a South Asian-owned, there are cases about companies that have sued others for race discrimination, discrimination where the discriminators were explicit about what they thought about the race of that corporation. So we've seen courts impute race to a corporation in these kinds of cases. And outside of the courtroom, we routinely hear references to Black businesses, Hispanic businesses, Asian American businesses. But what about US firms that are not Black or Hispanic or Asian American? Are these businesses white? And if they are, why are they not explicitly called white? I've never heard anyone refer to a firm as a white corporation. And I think this rhetorical discrepancy is significant. The fact that personal racial identity is invisible to many white Americans, or something about which many white Americans don't think, that is one of the most salient privileges that white individuals enjoy. And the same can be true with respect to white corporations. The invisibility of whiteness normalizes it. Its invisibility obscures the magnitude of the privilege that whiteness affords to persons who are white, including corporate persons. So of course, the next question has to be, if explicit and honest discourse about the race of corporations can make racism in the business setting more visible, how do we do that? How do we determine a corporation's race? Richard Brooks, in a 2006 article called Incorporating Race, described what he called the signaling model of race. And under this model, a corporation's racial identity is shaped by signals sent when a corporation interacts with the rest of the world. One example is when a closely held corporation signals its race by certifying itself as a minority firm. But public corporations, unlike closely held corporations, they don't convey explicit signals about their racial identity. But the signals that public corporations send about racial identity are implicit. So it seems to me that a public company implicitly signals that it is white when almost all of its directors, its executives, and its senior managers are white. John Calmore explained the connection between racial identity and commitments in his scholarship. And he observed that legal persons adopt identities for the same reasons as natural persons. Identities signify commitments of one group of people to other groups, commitments of one group of people to communities. So hiring and promotion disparities that advantage white individuals, they demonstrate a corporate commitment to white individuals. And corporations that do business only or primarily with suppliers that are white, corporations that give white consumers better service, that's the predatory lending context, they all demonstrate a corporate commitment to white consumers, white suppliers, and white employees. And even when a firm's adoption of racial identity through its unconscious commitments to others, even though it's implicit, it's still very relevant. A white firm's implicit commitment to white stakeholders, it's not always morally blameworthy. Most times it's not. But it does advantage many white Americans while disadvantaging and even exploiting, in some instances, stakeholders of color. My co-author Janice and I commissioned a composer to write a song conveying the human cost of predatory lending. And the composer used the words of some of the predatory lending victims we had interviewed in order to create the lyrics of the song. We had the song recorded at a church in South Jamaica, Queens, here in New York. And South Jamaica is one of the epicenters of predatory lending. I think Anel is going to drop a link to the video we had recorded. And I hope that you have time to watch the video on your own after today's Q&A. What you'll hear in the video are descriptions of the stories of Black consumers who were victimized by predatory corporations. Corporations that, in my opinion, have implicitly signaled that they are white. The unambiguous naming of the race of the predatory firms like Wells Fargo, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase helps to reveal the racism, the discrimination. The explicit racializing of predatory financial institutions as white helps us as a nation to avoid the kind of victim blaming that emerged when the foreclosure crisis began. And that victim blaming narrative focused on the borrowers and considered none of the predatory conduct of corporate lenders. The narrative included statements like, well, those borrowers were too greedy. They wanted things that they simply hadn't worked for, or the borrowers were financially illiterate. But I think the explicit imputation of whiteness to the financial firms helps us to focus on the predatory conduct of those financial firms. Let me end by just talking a little bit more about the video that I hope that you'll have time to watch. You'll see 22 singers. 11 of the singers you'll see are friends of mine. There's a judge, a few lawyers, a librarian, a teacher, a hair salon owner. Janice, my co-author, and I, we're singing in the video, so don't expect much in terms of musical quality. But the other 11 singers, they still live in or near South Jamaica in Queens, a neighborhood that still bears the scars of mortgage predation. If you drive through South Jamaica now, you will still see boarded up houses that were lost in foreclosure. My grandparents and parents used to live in South Jamaica. My brother and I, however, we grew up in the modest but private home my parents were able to buy in a nearby but much more stable neighborhood. We continued to attend the church in South Jamaica, Queens. But thanks to my parents' hard work, my life is dramatically different from the singers in the video who still live in South Jamaica. One of the participants was experiencing homelessness when we recorded the video. Another had lost her home in foreclosure. And yet another singer's daughter was experiencing homelessness at the time we recorded. We recorded the video at the end of 2018 in October. And tragically, 3 of the people you'll see in the video, people who are not old members of the church where we recorded, they passed away from COVID. I tell you these facts about the personal lives of some of the church members you'll see if you watch the video, because their stories reveal an important part of the socioeconomic reality of Black America. We gathered together to record this song about an American tragedy, but the 2 groups who came together, my friends who do not live in or near South Jamaica, and my childhood friends who remain in the embattled neighborhood, we live in different worlds. My friends and I have never come close to facing disclosure. A couple of my friends contracted COVID, but They had resources and medical care that kept them alive, even those who were 65 and over. This is the diverging socioeconomic reality that distinguishes middle-class Black America from working-class Black America. But all of us, working-class Black people, middle-class Black people, and even high-earning Black professionals are far more likely than our white counterparts to be the targets of predatory lenders. So regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of cultural differences, whether we are immigrants or the descendants of recent immigrants, whether our ancestors were brought to the US centuries ago, unfortunately, we are all targets. I thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions and your comments.
Thank you, Professor Wade. And again, if you do have questions, please send them through the chat to me, Kelly Weiss, and I can get those questions asked. So we'll start with a question from Bill, who says, there is a clear, persistent history of US capitalism actively and aggressively practicing and utilizing racism. What should motivate white corporate America to change when it has been extremely profitable to practice racism, i.e. to maintain inequities that were embedded in US capitalism's foundation?
Yeah, that's a hard question. What will motivate corporate leaders to change? And I think the only thing that will motivate them is activism. And I think one form, one version of activism would include activists becoming shareholders in large public companies and holding corporate leaders accountable for what they say. Any corporate leader who talks about racial injustice publicly at least says that they care about racial injustice. So yes, it is profitable, but business leaders have to acknowledge, and they do acknowledge, that we're not talking about shareholder wealth maximization or enhancement at all costs. We must comply with law, or businesses have to comply with all applicable law. And that includes the law that prohibits discrimination. And so any company that fails to comply with anti-discrimination law has a board that is potentially breaching its fiduciary duty of loyalty to monitor compliance at the company. And so I think we have to be very direct and very aggressive about inspiring corporate leaders to focus on this kind of change, because unlike some law and economics scholars who said decades ago that, well, if discrimination and racism are inefficient, they will end, they will stop. And now decades later, we know that that is not true. Discrimination and racism continue. So we've got to be, or activists, those who believe in racial justice, and I guess that's everybody who's here on this call, have to be aggressive about reaching corporate leaders and holding them accountable for what they say and what actually is at the company, and approaching this as a compliance matter.
We have a question from Raj, who says, wanting to know about research and what you found in looking into corporate boards. Have you found evidence that having an African American on a board would affect predatory lending?
What a great question. No, I haven't found any evidence that racial diversity on a board would change this kind of issue. And the reason for that is boards should make sure that there are monitoring systems in place, systems that monitor compliance with law. They should certainly do that, but they're not engaged in the actual day-to-day decision-making. That's the job of corporate officers. But it doesn't mean that board members cannot question, and they should question, compliance with law that prohibits the kind of discrimination and the kind of predation that I described. The problem for Black people on corporate boards is that there are few boards where Black people have reached a critical mass. You may have one or two Black individuals on a corporate board. And these are individuals who may not always feel comfortable speaking out, or they may not think that predatory lending is a problem. When Black people are appointed to a board, you're getting a Black person. You're not getting a particular perspective. And there are Black people who think that Black people, in fact, are to blame for low home ownership numbers, who are not financially literate enough to have avoided predatory lending. I remember when a friend of mine who is a tax lawyer, she did my closing for me. And I remember looking at the mortgage document and saying, I don't understand what this says. And she said, nobody understands. So clearly it's not financial literacy that led to this foreclosure crisis in the Black community, but not all people agree. And you may have a person appointed to the board or elected to the board who simply doesn't share the perspective that I have.
Many companies have responded to calls to address racism in corporations by adding a new C-suite role, a chief diversity officer. What is the potential for the chief diversity officer to address exploitative business practices?
Well, there's a great deal of potential if the chief diversity officer is willing and brave enough to talk about the fact that we cannot stop at an examination of diversity and diversity efforts, that racism and discrimination are still prevalent, they're ubiquitous in our nation and certainly in corporate America. And so the chief, for me, I think a better title would be a chief anti-racism officer, but that's not a happy concept, right? And so business leaders don't, and that's one of the reasons why business leaders don't talk about racism and anti-racism. It is far more comfortable to talk about things like diversity, but we have to move beyond diversity in order to address some of these problems. So a chief diversity officer could address some of these issues if that person is willing to grapple with the continuing problem of racism and discrimination, because getting or achieving greater diversity is not going to stop the problem of predation and discrimination, whether it's in the workplace or discrimination against consumers.
Okay. We have a question from Dina Sharapur. She says, so many companies that have exploited Black communities as a business practice are incorporated in Delaware. What role is there for Delaware corporate law to address these unjust practices?
Wow, that is a question that I'm not sure I can answer. And you're absolutely right that many of these companies were in fact incorporated in Delaware, but I'm not sure there's any greater role from the state that the state could play that would be helpful, because states already prohibit racial discrimination. This is already, there are many laws prohibiting the kind of racism and discrimination that we see against Black employees and Black consumers and Black communities. So the state has done its job to some extent. And that's why I think the best hope is an internal solution where shareholders will hold boards accountable for monitoring compliance with the laws that are already in place. The laws exist, but business leaders ignore them. And so it's only shareholders who can bring a suit to say that this failure to monitor has harmed shareholders by casting the corporation in a bad light, bad publicity. Maybe the company had to pay some sort of fine or penalty. I think the power is in the hands of shareholders who buy shares and work through the shareholder proposal process, or who write demand letters explaining the failure to comply with applicable law, the law that states have put into place, writing letters to the board and asking the board to take corrective action with respect to the failure to, or the utter and ongoing extreme failure to monitor compliance with law. There's case law that says it has to be an extreme failure to comply. But I think the best solution is an internal solution, and asking companies to do what they say they do. And that is engage in work and efforts that do not discriminate and that promote equity.
What do you see when we're looking at solutions? How long do these things take? Because these discussions have been going on for so long, but what do you predict for the future?
That I am stumped. You know what I predict, actually? I predict that we'll continue to agitate racial justice folks. We'll continue to talk about these issues. We'll continue to make some progress in the business setting and beyond. I'm hopeful about the potential impact for corporate culture to impact the culture outside of the corporation, that if employment discrimination is not tolerated within the company, that people will go out into the nation with a different mindset. I'm not sure that hearts and minds will change, but I do think that corporate decisions can change our overall society here in the United States. I do think that that is possible. But I happen to agree with critical race theorist Derek Bell, who says, well, racism is integral, it's permanent, it's indestructible in the United States. And I think that understanding the permanence of racism in the US means that we will not, or business leaders will not stop at diversity discussions, but they'll explore why there's so few people at the top of corporate, people of color who are at the top of corporate hierarchy, or why consumers who are predatory lending victims are disproportionately Black and brown. Understanding that racism is permanent is not a mindset of giving up. It simply means that we go about a way of interpreting the law and applying the law and implementing the law. We go about it in a way that is realistic. And I think being realistic means we can't stop at diversity discussions. We've got to focus on what we will live with for the rest of our lives and for the rest of the existence of this nation, founded on race and racism. I know this is not a happy note on which to end, but I don't feel hopeless in agreeing with Derek Bell that racism is permanent. I just see a chance, an opportunity for a more realistic way to deal with these kinds of issues.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for all of your thoughtful responses. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you very much.
I just want to thank everyone for being here today. And I'd like to especially thank Professor Wade for her insightful and powerful presentation. We look forward to hosting all of you at our next Racial Justice Speaker Series event. Thank you.